So our next speaker will be Tonelli, who is an assistant professor of popular music at the University of Groningen, interested, among others, in histories of free jazz sound singing and associated theorizations. And so the talk will be entitled Techniques and Taxonomies in Free Jazz Sound Singing. And as soon as
How do I get ready, the presentation up? Do I need to steal this cable?
We'll see. Do you want this? No.
Oh. Perfect. Well, I'm glad I asked you that question because that was the perfect lead into mine. You're talking about labeling. I'm going to talk about taxonomies. This would have been the perfect panel if I would have been talking about my work on human-animal connections, because I've done a bunch of that as well. A lot of my research is about improvised music, free jazz, this genre I call soundsinging, which I'll tell you about here. And the way that the human-animal divide comes up in my work, particularly in chapter 5 of the book that I'll shamelessly plug here, is that I'm interested in the symbolic functions of what some people call, and what Michael Edgerton, I'll tell you later, calls extranormal voice. And I'm a performer who uses a lot of extranormal techniques when I'm improvising. And I've found that audiences, often when they have a strong aversion to the music I'm making, will compare it to animal sound as a way of dismissing it or a way of saying it's valueless. So I think in my work it's really important to remember that it's fine to have these associations with animal sound, but it's also human sound. It's not fine to say this is not human sound, right? So maybe that's something we can talk about more since I'm sandwiched in between the two animal papers. But on to taxonomy. My paper is about the ways that different singers label their sounds when they're working in this genre. So it's about the different approaches that sound singers have taken to nomenclature, and I'll highlight the contribution the practice of sound singing has made to creating a systematized nomenclature for unconventional vocal and non-vocal oral sound. And then I'll make a case for the argument that the non-standardized, idiosyncratic nomenclature that many sound singers have developed in and for their personal singing practice is also of value to voice analysis in relation to the analysis of why vocalists vocalize the way they do and what experiential dimensions and benefits those practices afford. As a vocalist myself, I'm very concerned with that. So the reason I use the term sound singing is that it's the term used by the singer that first exposed me to the practice and who welcomed me into the practice. And his name is Paul Dutton, and he's a singer and poet based in Toronto, who first developed his largely improvisational vocal practice in the context of a sound poetry ensemble that he was a part of from 1972 to 1988 called the Four Horsemen. Sound singing can be understood as a sustained practice of vocal discovery that involves improvisation and the gradual building up of a palette of approaches to unconventional vocal and non-vocal oral sound making. So you get a sense of the practice. I'll play you a short example. In addition to my solo practice of sound singing, I also lead improvisational choirs. That the politics around them are anyone can join it and they can use any sound in the context of these choirs. And anyone can join and they can engage in a practice of personal vocal discovery and building up a personalized vocal approach in these contexts. So the first example I'll play for you features my choir. I'm off camera conducting them. One of the three choirs, I should say, that I've formed in different cities around the world. And it also features one of the vocalists I'll talk about in my talk, the UK-based vocalist and composer Trevor Wishart. We brought Trevor to St. John's, Newfoundland to work with my choir, and this is a clip of an improvised solo by Wishart with texture added from the choir. And it starts with Trevor interacting with the youngest member of the choir in St. John's. So I'll use the term techniques later when I'm talking about vocal taxonomies, but I'm going to resist calling this building up of a palette the development of techniques. Because one of the reasons Dutton developed the term sound singing was to resist the labeling of his singing as a practice of singing with extended vocal techniques. He rejects all three of the terms in extended vocal techniques. He rejects extended because he doesn't consider the sounds he employs extensions from any other sound, including pitch-based singing. And he rejects vocal because many of the sounds he employs are non-vocal oral sounds. And he rejects technique because, as he says, he considers himself an artist, not a technician, and his practice is often one where he's looking to surprise himself vocally, not one where he's seeking to control those sounds or reproduce a sound that he's made before. I don't consider all vocal improvisation sound singing if it lacks a focus on building a personalized palette of unconventional approaches to vocal and non-vocal oral sound. I don't think it's really sound singing. Conversely, not all sound singing is improvisational, though improvisatory exploration is probably always a part of every practice that could be considered sound singing. So I'm interested in vocal improvisation and vocal exploration, and especially the interpersonal processes it affords, the social processes it affords, including forms of performer-audience encounter that it affords, and the meaning-making processes that unfold for audience members during and after these encounters, and because of the co-presence of certain kinds of vocal and non-vocal oral sounds and certain kinds of people and bodies. I've written about all these things alongside a history of sound singing in free jazz contexts in my book, Voices Found, Free Jazz and Singing, and Chapter 5 is the one where I go into the human-animal connections. The collected body of all the works of all the sound singers that I write about in this book amounts to an incredible diversity of unconventional ways of using the voice. And all of these vocalists have unique vocabularies for referring to particular vocal and non-vocal oral approaches to sound making. Though many sound singers resist analytical categorizations of their sounds, some sound singers have been interested in systematizing a taxonomy of unconventional vocal sounds and isolating and identifying the various parameters of the vocal apparatus shaping these sounds. Trevor Wishart and Michael Edward Edgerton are two singers who have created accessible but complex taxonomies of what Edgerton calls extranormal vocal sounds. Their desire to systematize those sounds comes from the fact that both work as composers, but their intimate embodied knowledge of the extranormal possibilities of the voice was developed in part through their work as vocal improvisers. Wishart's book of Lost Voices from 1979 presented a taxonomy of 169 vocal techniques, and a few years later, in 1985, he published On Sonic Art, which contains what he refers to as, quote, a more systematic classification of the sound materials, end quote, discussed in Book of Lost Voices. On Sonic Art and his notes to his 1982 piece, Antikratos, display his notational system for the techniques he identified. In Edgerton's introduction to his book, The 21st Century Voice, Contemporary and Traditional Extranormal Voice, he explains that he chose to organize the book within a bioacoustic framework that would attempt to communicate quantifiable information to a large readership with diverse interests. Wishart claims his system is based less on physiological analysis of vocal technique and more on description in terms of sound objects, but he starts by identifying the various oscillators of the vocal apparatus and then moves on to talk about the ways that parts of the vocal tract can filter these oscillations and add noise to them. He moves on to talk about the vocal tract's capacity to excite 2 or 3 simultaneous oscillating sources, so his work to me does seem like it's grounded in a bioacoustic framework. Part 1 of Edgerton's system categorizes types of airflow, distinguishing egressive from ingressive airflow and lunged from half-lunged airflow and unlunged airflow, which is a taxonomy he creates Wishart with. He then distinguishes voiced from unvoiced oral sound before talking about the sonic effects of variations in approaches to bodily air support. Part 2 of his system deals with the various oscillators. Part 3 deals with the filters, and Part 4 deals with combinatorial approaches. And throughout all the parts of the book, Edgerton illustrates various approaches to notating these techniques and these combinations of techniques. So the two books present a similar framework. And Edgerton's book presents it with greater detail, with an array of diagrams, detailed discussions of how to achieve and control these techniques, discussions of vocal health, and detailed subsections with various comparative charts and lists systematizing combinatorial possibilities of the various oscillators and filters of the vocal tract. Both books illustrate their system with accompanying recordings. The audio illustrations in On Sonic Art are all performed by Wishart himself, whereas the audio illustrations in Edgerton's book come from a wide range of recorded sources, many of which are recordings by free jazz sound singers like Dutton, as well as Anna Hamler, Gretchen Baima, Sanko Namchalak, David Moss, Phil Minton, Jaap Blonk, and others, as well as by Edgerton himself and Wishart. Wishart and Edgerton's practice as sound singers gave them a deep embodied understanding of a broad range of the sonic affordances of our vocal and oral tracks that was essential to the taxonomies they produced. Their taxonomies, because of the systematic approach they took, are the taxonomies that seem most relevant to voice analysis, but I want to turn now to observations of more asystematic and personal approaches to naming and knowing vocal and non-vocal oral sound, and I want to suggest that there are certain kinds of vocal analysis that don't benefit from standardized nomenclature. One of the terminologies that I've picked up from the sound singer Jaap Blonk is the term the cheek synthesizer. It refers to the creation of turbulent airflow directed into the cheeks and usually filtered by the teeth and/or manual manipulation of the outside of the cheeks with one's fingers. I'll play you a short example of Jaap introducing the cheek synthesizer and then improvising with it. In the beginning, he talks about how sad it is that many of us as adults don't use it after we're children. Children tend to use it quite a bit.
So, this last piece is made for, not for voice, but for the other instrument, the second instrument every human being has, although almost no one plays it anymore when they're grown up, which is not the cheek synthesizer. And the pity that so few people play it, because it's a nice instrument and you can play it in stereo, as you will hear. Solo for cheek synthesizer.
So we could ask, is this term cheek synthesizer of any value to something we could consider voice analysis? And if so, what's the source of that value? I personally think it tells us a lot about the way Jaap experiences the embodied process of this approach to sound making. And I think my sense of why it does comes from my own embodied experiences working with the sounds he categorizes as cheek synthesizer sounds. I think the term cheek synthesizer connotes a sense of surprise at a variety of distinct timbres that can be achieved through variations in the airflow and the filtering of the airflow. One of the core affordances of synthesizers is the wide variety of timbres they can produce, and Jaap's choice to refer to this approach as synthesizer-like likely reflects his appreciation of the wide timbral range afforded by this approach and the quick ability one has to switch between timbres when manipulating the cheeks and the airflow using this approach. I think it also conveys an appreciation for the fact, and he mentioned this in the beginning of his introduction, that we have two separate cheeks, and when we employ this approach to sound making, the cheeks can both be manipulated independently of one another and create their own flows of sound simultaneously. Jaap's familiarity with the fact that there are monophonic and polyphonic synthesizers likely informed his invention of this term. The independence of the two cheeks and the way you can combine two distinct timbral flows feels like a similar affordance to what can be afforded by a polyphonic synthesizer. Finally, I think the term cheek synthesizer also connotes a surprise at and appreciation of the ways flows of sounds can be sustained when following this approach to sound making. As this technique requires little airflow to sustain, the human body can sustain this kind of airflow for a fairly long duration. Of course, this is one of the distinctions between synthesizers and most other instruments, that with synthesizers often you can sustain sounds indefinitely. So these observations are not just analytical comparisons between this non-vocal oral approach and the affordances of synthesizers. The analytical dimension this term gives access to is what a particular sound singer who employs this approach to sound making values about this technique as they feel it in their bodies. It helps me analyze and come to a partial understanding of what it felt like for Jaap to discover and explore this approach or instrument that he says almost no one plays when they're grown up. And this is something that I want to capture in my research. I want to understand the experiential affordances and benefits of these embodied practices for the singers that engage with them. We could, of course, refer to the cheek synthesizer as manual manipulation of buccal airflow dentally filtered, but this more standardized nomenclature removes the hints at experiential value that the more personalized vocabulary contains. This issue of standardization of terminology comes up in Paul Jackson's text, Developments in Extended Vocal Technique Music. Jackson discusses the reclassification of sounds that Trevor Wishart undertook between his 1979 book, Book of Lost Voices, and his 1985 book on sonic art. Jackson notes that between the two texts, Wishart dispenses with titles such as Constipation Multiphonics and Monkey in favor of there's an animal moment. There's a bit in there. In favor of a less suggestive but clearer nomenclature. Of course, that clarity of nomenclature enables certain kinds of analytical goals and communication processes, but it's also important to consider the analytical value and the social value of the suggestiveness that's lessened in the move from the personalized to the bioacoustically standardized nomenclature. Another example of this is Leon Thomas's approach, which he refers to as solar phone. Stephen Feld described this approach as a modified rapid alternation yodel technique with a kind of vocabilic scat singing that sounded more glottal than the dominant male scat of the era. Let's listen to a solar phone solo that Thomas recorded in 1969 for his album Spirits Known and Unknown. What you're going to hear is part of a performance of his song, Song for My Father, and you'll hear a bit of the end of the chorus lyric, and then the wordless solar phone solo begins.
That was my dad, the man. Yeah,
Cut it short because I'm running out of time here. So the term solar phone connotes the spiritual aspect of the embodied practice afforded to Thomas through his approach to vocalization. He considered the approach a gift given to him by his ancestors, something that shocked him when it first came out of him. He said, "I didn't know where it came from. I realized that it was me, and I realized that the ancestor had arrived. It surprises me. It does everything of its own volition. I call it solar phone. The voice is not me. The voice is ancient." Soul and solar connote the spiritual experience this approach afforded Thomas in a way that a modified rapid alternation yodel technique doesn't. And if your object of analysis is the experiential aspects of vocal practice, this personalized nomenclature is a rich way in. In his 1992 essay, Beyond Doo-Wop, or How I Came to Realize That Hank Williams is Avant-Garde, Paul Dutton quotes the protagonist in Guy Davenport's novel, The Death of Picasso, saying, "Ah" is an undictionaried word, implying joy, rich fatigue, accomplishment, fulfillment. Dutton then goes on to say that he's been content to cluck, smack, whoop, burble, and more without dictionarying any of it. Cheek synthesizer and solar phone, Wishart's constipation multiphonics or monkey, Dutton's references to lip flubbing, clucking, and burbling are all undictionaried terms. That, like the word ah, we can partially but never completely understand the connotations and implications of if we participate in the embodied practices they're linked to. Analysis of what vocalization feels like, the embodied experiences it affords, and the value of those experiences is, I think, an important element that we should consider when we think about voice analysis, and that's where I'll end. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Any questions in the audience or online?
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. For Chris, one question. As an instrumentalist, I'm really, and also I mean, like free jazz. You know, I think you're studying, working on this. You probably compare to the practice of instruments compared to the singing, because you know in free jazz everybody knows it was using unusual parts of the existing instrument, or unusual way, or something like this, or so in that sense the singing as well, the using unusual or unused parts of your body, but that's the point where we are come up with this is different, because every instrument is, of course, regardless of any very possibility of each of the instruments, but all the time our body is using such a tool, you know. But in this case, the agency equals the tool, the body, because we are using bodies. So I was wondering if you have any insights about this, you know, working on this, especially compared to the case of instruments, using instruments, and compared to this, maybe many I guess insightful remarks or something like this.
Yeah, thank you for the question. You asked the horn question earlier, right, as well, right? So that came up again, right? This line between the instrument and the voice. In chapter 3 of my book, I talk a lot about when particular imitative practices do factor into sound singing. And one of the things that I'm interested about the fact that they do factor into sound singing is the fact that this gives us, sound singing as a practice, gives us a space where we can really take all the dynamisms of the external world into our body in a way that kind of normative day-to-day embodiment doesn't allow us to do. And so that chapter 3 comes up with a lot of discussions about that, both in terms of musical instruments, but also in terms of like subway cars or animals or machines. And chapter 2 actually is all about the history of electronic sounds informing different vocal practices within the sound singing sphere. So one of the things I haven't done enough, I think, in my career is think about how instrumentalists think about this. So you could probably answer the question a lot better than I could. I think when you're an instrumentalist, your instrument becomes an extension of your body in a lot of ways so it probably doesn't make sense for me to say that there's a really strong distinction between being a vocalist and being an instrumentalist in improvised music, and the kinds of ways that your instrument does feel like it's part of you, and instruments, of course, get gendered as well as the voice does. But on one hand, one thing I think that the divide of the tool, especially when you're not an instrumentalist yourself, does is that voices people take really personally. And so when audiences are trying audiences, when they have a strong negative reaction to sound singing, they often not just say these sounds are animal sounds, they say they're sounds of bodies that have lost control. They can't even acknowledge that the vocalist might be in a certain degree of control of these sounds. And the symbolic order that tells them what their own body means and that they're part of a privileged category, that maybe animal is a lower category, might not happen as much when the instrument is externalized. I think it might happen more for the players themselves, but maybe less for audiences. So I don't know if that's a good answer to your question, but like I said, you could probably answer the question better than me, but I hope those are some useful thoughts related to that.
Yeah. Actually, as a long-time guitarist, when I was started to learn very seriously how to sing, well, before then I was kind of hating the singers because many guitarists especially. But after this moment, I got a kind of respect for all the singers because it's totally different thing. Using bodies and manipulating or as a tool with your body is totally different thing. So
Interesting discussion. Thank you for the question.
So in terms of free jazz as well, there was the kind of the lead very very interesting thinking insights from there. So that's what I'm thinking. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
And there is another question, I think.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. It's always very interesting to hear about free music in general, free expression. And actually, I have questions about two terms that are using. I will start with the first one. I can also explore further, but I wanted to ask you if Dutton explained in your readings if you found an explanation for the sound singing term, since he's rejecting this expanded technique. And what was the third word? Extended vocal technique? Yeah. I was thinking that isn't it like an oxymoron? Like, can you sing without a sound? Is it like silent singing? Can that be? Or can it be free vocal jazz? Because sound singing for me sounds like an oxymoron. Like, can we sing without a sound? We can make sounds without singing. Yeah. I understand the point, but I would not maybe use both of them and make
It's a poetic term. It's not a perfect term.
Yeah. Did he say anything about? Is he explaining why
he got this? He used to use free voice singing, but then he didn't really like that. After some time, someone called him, said, "You're a singer of sounds." So certain people create a divide between sound and song, and probably that upholds a kind of hierarchical division that song is a kind of elevated form of sound as well. So I mean, maybe his term even reinforces a kind of hierarchical division, but since he's embracing the sound side of the song sound divide, maybe that also elevates it as well. So you're right, it's an oxymoron, but that's not going to stop him from using it.
It's kind of like Sprechstimme. Like Schoenberg's Sprechstimme is Sprechstimme would be like speech and voice.
Isn't it Sprechgesang?
Oh,
Sprechgesang.
So that's not what he. Okay.
Sprechstimme and Sprechgesang are both terms.
Sprechgesang, yes, like also in classical music that you have like singing, speech singing.
Yeah. Okay.
Spoken singing. Yeah, that is indeed and. Because then also comes maybe into question the difference between using the word vocalist and singer, and then vocal and singing. Like it could be free vocal jazz maybe. But I was just thinking, did he explain this in his writings, these kind of things? And then my second question would be connected to the term jazz in this context. What are the jazz elements that you are using, for example? Why isn't it like free vocal expression, for example? What are the jazz things that you incorporate, for example, with the choir? Or the examples that you played, of course, there are jazz standards that they are singing, but otherwise, what are the jazz elements?
There are two very complicated questions that I could talk about for a long time, and I'll try to keep it quick. So Dutton's writing is really great to look at for his history of trying to talk about the fact that there's a continuum between song and speech. So this came up through your comment, but he really does a lot of work to try to blur those two terms. But that's not what you asked. You asked more about sound singing as a term. And his writing, I don't think, really explains the term, but I, in my book, in the first chapter, address both of your questions, and I talk about how I think there's a practical sense of sound singing that I described here, just like certain kinds of ways of working with vocal discovery and finding a kind of expansion of your vocal palette. And then the other is a kind of philosophical sense where people want to create a divide to say that this form of singing is not singing. And so I use the term sound singing to talk about the reclaiming of the term singing in relationship to these forms of using your voice. Because I think politically that's really important. It's the same answer with jazz. This is jazz, right? It comes out of a jazz tradition. It's informed by a lot of other traditions, but it was developed more than in any other cultural space in jazz spaces. So it's a form of jazz, and there are people that don't want to call it jazz, but I think it's politically important to say this is part of the jazz umbrella.
Okay, but what would be the elements that connect it to jazz or make it to be jazz?
Doesn't matter. The history, the context, the fact that it developed in jazz-informed spaces.
Okay, so it's like a little revolution against what happened at a certain point. In that sense, it would be jazz.
Right, the power.
Okay, thank you.
Is it the same case? I have a question, sorry. Yeah, sorry, this might sound like a bit of a weird question, but it's late and I'm starting to get tired. What do you make of the pull towards taxonomy, classification, typology, especially in this kind of background?
Yeah, I mean, it's important for a lot of reasons. I think it's also important to embrace these poetic personal taxonomies. So I think systematizing is important, but so is the other side of it. Calling this, saying these sounds sound like animal sounds is important, but so is insisting this is a human body, right? Saying that these sound like a body out of control, okay, already, that's okay, but these are also bodies very much in control for a lot of what they're doing. So I would answer the same question, or I would answer all these questions the same way, that I think philosophically, discursively, we need to keep both in the playing field.
Thank you.
Thank you again.